Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webcast entitled, How the Current Political Climate is Affecting the Practice of Public Relations. Today's conversation is brought to you by the Stevens Group. This is the latest in their series of executive discussions for business professionals involved in the public relations industry. Compro is thrilled to be working with them. The Stevens Group is our partner for the Mergers and Acquisitions channel on compro.biz. I invite you to check out their really important and relevant content. For today's discussion, we welcome our hosts, Art Stevens, Managing Partner, and Rich Cicchetti, Senior Partner at the Stevens Group. I also want to shout out of appreciation to Richard Levick and Levick for hosting our roundtable discussion, providing a lovely luncheon, and facilitating what I'm sure will be a really dynamic discussion. Now, before I turn the floor over to Art and Rich, just a little housekeeping. Much appreciation to Dynamic Reel Productions and OnStream Media for producing our webcast. We wouldn't be here without them. Finally, to submit a question online or comment at any time during the broadcast, please click on the Ask the Question button on the bottom of your screen. We're going to try to get to all of your questions. If not, please don't be remiss. Our panelists will see them after the webcast, and we promise to be responsive. With that, I'm pleased to pass the mic to Art Stevens and let the conversation begin.
Thank you, Faye. Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists, for being with us today. Thank you for all of you who are tuning in and our in-person guests here at Levick Communications in Washington, D.C. I'm Art Stevens, and I am managing partner of the Stevens Group. And right next to me, on my right, is Rich Cicchetti, who is my senior partner. You'll be hearing from both of us as Rich and I will be asking our distinguished panel today the questions based on the topic that you're well aware of. To begin with, let me say this, that it is an understatement to say that we're all living in chaotic times. In fact, I chatted with the panel beforehand, and I think they certainly agree with that conclusion. The United States is experiencing an ideological divide in our political climate and conversation that is unparalleled in our history. Never before has the media been so attacked by a sitting president as it is today. And since the lifeline of public relations is the media, we're here today to talk about just how the constant angry mob mentality and constant attacks on the media is affecting the practice of public relations. We've got some wonderful speakers today, and we're very pleased to bring them to you. First of all, let me introduce Lanny Davis. Lanny, as you know, is a lawyer, a crisis manager, consultant, author, and a television commentator providing strategic counsel to clients that are under the scrutiny of crisis management and legal issues. Richard Levick is the head of Levick, a Washington, D.C. based organization with offices in a number of U.S. cities. And under his leadership, Levick has set new standards in global communications and brand protection for corporations, countries, and major institutions. Mr. Levick is one of the communication industry's most respected and important spokespersons and thought leaders. And also joining us today is Kayanne Schulman, who is head of the Washington, D.C. Marketplace and Public Affairs Office for Ketchum, one of the largest and most respected public relations organizations in the world. She is a veteran corporate communications professional with nearly 20 years of experience in public affairs, public policy, grassroots campaigns, market research, and consumer activity. That is our panel. And the way we're going to work today is Rich and I will be asking the panel questions. We will invite them to exchange views with each other. And when a particular question runs dry, we'll ask the next one. And later on in the broadcast, we have a number of in-person guests here, as well as write-in guests. I think your computer will tell you exactly how to turn in your questions. And of course, we will answer any questions later on from the distinguished group of people who are present in our audience here today. So that's the groundwork. And we're going to start with Lanny Davis, and I'm going to ask him a very direct question, Lanny, and that is, what impact do you think that Donald Trump has had on the public's impression of public relations practice, and how is public relations being affected by the current administration?
I think I'll pass on that and ask no. Look, public relations at its best is about truth and getting your facts out. That's a mantra that in a book that I wrote about crisis management, my subtitle about the truth and having a bad story being mitigated is tell it early, tell it all, tell it yourself. And the it is the truth. Without being partisan, I'm not a Trump supporter, I'm a Democrat. But I also had a very close friend who was President of the United States named George W. Bush, who I went to college with. While I disagreed with his policies, I never felt the way I do about Mr. Trump when it comes to the truth. I think we have in this particular president, I don't think he would necessarily disagree, somebody who doesn't quite care about being accurate because his audience and his constituency places a higher value on defining the enemy than on telling the truth. That's just my opinion. I know there are supporters of President Trump that would disagree. But in the public relations world, since we begin and end our job by getting the truth out and sometimes dealing with the harsh truth by explaining the bad facts and trying to do something about them, I think that under President Trump, the diminishment of the importance of facts and truth makes public relations much more difficult.
So what I think is important to do, and you've done a nice job of setting it up, is how do we take some of the chaos and the unpredictability out of this equation and provide that stability for our clients and stakeholders to really take a look at what's happening. And so if we were to strip away that, what this is, and we were to look at it for a client, one of the challenges is there's a reputation issue in PR with the media. And we have arguably a president who has made it his mission to damage the reputation of an institution, the media in this case, and by extension, public relations. So when we look at studies on trust, we see across the board all-time lows for all institutions. What I do think is important, and something that Axios put out earlier this week, and maybe it was last week, it feels like a lifetime with the news that's happened this week, is how do we combat fake news? How can we right the ship and take down the temperature? And they had 4 thoughts, and it involved all the stakeholders involved. So again, if you think about this as a reputation program, what should politicians do? They should stop using fake news. What should the media do? They should stop injecting opinion when that happens. They should stick to reporting the facts and the truth, as Mr. Davis shared. What should social media companies do? Because you want to talk about public relations changing. Arguably, the president has shined a light on how our discipline has changed, but many individuals are getting their news from social media platforms, not news websites, not broadcast news. And how should that be regulated, whether it's self-regulated or, through government and industry? And then finally, what can we do? So for me, I know that, I don't check the president's tweets every day. I know the media is going to report on it as soon as something comes out. I make sure that my social media feeds are with credible news organizations and that I'm consuming news that is reported in a way that takes, the principles of journalism to heart. And I do that by extension for my clients. And I think how we can calibrate can help take the temperature down, but certainly doesn't solve the problem.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Faye and Compro, because I think who else would have the courage to have one mic between 2 competitors? So I think it's I think it's very courageous. So let me try and answer that question, Art, on a couple of levels. One, I think from a constitutional level, this is a deeply challenging time. You have the separation of powers in question. We have the politicalization of the Supreme Court. And perhaps most risky is we have the loss of soft power, both on a domestic level and on an international level. Ronald Reagan would never take his suit jacket off in the Oval Office because he felt too much respect, reverence, and it was all about understanding soft power. His relationship with Tip O'Neill, his relationship with Ted Kennedy. How do we get things done as a country? So the split, the latest violence, the natural outcome of all these attacks that we're seeing, or threats of violence, with now 10 pipe bombs have been sent all to Democrats, many, including many African Americans, many women, and a Jew, all of whom have been targets of this administration, tell us this is going to get worse before it gets better. Two, this is not an accident. 30 years ago, the Gasparov Doctrine was written by the then KGB, now FSB, the General Gasparov, which is how do the Russians compete with China and the West? Recognizing they could not compete militarily, they could not compete economically, they decided to, in fact, try and compete by disruption. Loss of faith in the Fourth Estate, loss of faith, as Lanny and Kayan refer to, into our institutions. When we do that, we no longer function as a society. You know, we all stop at stop signs, not because we believe that there's a police officer on the other corner about to give us a ticket, but because we're willing to incur that momentary inconvenience for a peaceful society. When we do without that, when we do away with that, as we're marching towards not just public relations, but everything we know, every institution, and certainly this town, Washington, will no longer function. And then finally, in terms of communications, I think for all of us, not just the public affairs practices, but all of us are having to learn how, even in the brand business, to understand grassroots communications, political communications, litigation communications. It requires a different approach to what used to be just selling soap suds or cookies.
Well, given the fact that we have a very large audience tuning in to watch this webcast, and many of them, maybe all of them, are public relations professionals who have clients. And the clients are corporations. We have a president who lies, who distorts the facts, who denies the advice of the majority of scientists that we have an impending climate crisis, and yet he seems to pay no consequences for his behavior. And what I'm wondering is, what impact do you think that has on the public's perception of corporations, your clients, their clients, when they put out messages about their business, about their products, about their services? Are they being taken seriously? Do you suspect that the public may think they just may be lying to us, but there are no consequences to pay? Have at it.
I think, and our Ketchum CEO Barry Rafferty has said this, that the void in leadership here in Washington has created an opportunity for business leaders and CEOs and other C-suites to step up and fill that void. And you see that with campaigns, for instance, with Colin Kaepernick, with Nike, with Patagonia last week, for the first time, setting a precedent of endorsing actual candidates, not just putting their opinions out in terms of where they stand in public land use or how they feel about the environment, but taking a step to endorse 2 Democratic senators in a midterm election year. And we have seen, and in working with our clients, that we are helping them refine their purpose, their CSR programs, what they stand for. We're also helping them evaluate when and where they should take a stand, because, you know, your description of the president, I would argue that half of the country roughly disagrees with it, whether we like it or not, or whether we believe he's a liar, whether we think that he's diminishing the Constitution and our systems of norms. As a corporation, as someone who has, needs consumers, we have to realize that a large part of that consumer base may disagree with the perception of the president. So how do we navigate that while still living up to personal responsibilities as leaders of an organization, balancing fiduciary responsibilities, shareholder responsibilities, and then the consumer, which is, arguably the end user. And so we're seeing that it creates an opportunity for business leaders. We're seeing business leaders step up and take opinions, but where we're seeing that go really well is when those business leaders and the C-suite are in tune with not just consumers, but their employee base. So we've seen some missteps, and I won't name companies, but where they go out and they're against the president and they receive backlash, or they're for the president and they receive backlash. That backlash is generated because that statement is not necessarily aligned with the workforce, with the mission, with the values of that organization, which may not want to be political, which may disagree. And so it's a fine line that you have to understand how to navigate, and that's where we've been helping our clients.
Well, the greatest problem in advising clients that I face is resignation that you can't beat the innuendo and falsehoods that are on the internet, and especially in social media. And the argument that they hear from in-house PR and sometimes their outhouse lawyers is just be quiet, don't try to fight.
Really?
It's hopeless. And of course, President Trump creates the atmosphere of hopelessness, because how do you fight for the truth when the President of the United States doesn't seem to care about the truth? And again, I say that I'm not a Trump supporter, but it's hard to find Trump supporters who disagree that his Twitter feed contains lies. They just don't mind, but they don't disagree. So my philosophy to my clients is don't give up and focus on the truth, not necessarily expressing political opinions and who to endorse, but focus on the truth and don't think that there aren't consequences to lying. Right now, this president is paying the consequences of having the lowest average approval rating in the history of the presidency for this stage of the presidency. I said average. He may be up, he may be down, but it's far less than a majority. They were high-fiving in the White House when they got to 45% in one poll. The average in Real Clear Politics is 43%. The greatest landslide in American history in a presidential contest was 61-39. Not far off where Donald Trump currently is at 43. So I would say he has paid the consequence, and I advise my clients when it comes to the internet and the innuendo and sometimes the outright lies that are on the internet, don't give up in fighting for facts and the truth about your company. That's ultimately your brand and your reputation. Don't be resigned and stay quiet, because people in-house will tell you, don't stir the hornet's nest, better to be quiet. Sometimes that's good advice, but on the most occasions that I have found, the better advice is fight back.
You know, Lanny raises a really interesting point here, which is that if you're winning, we now feel like it's okay to say and do anything. Eric Erickson, the conservative commentator and often religious commentator, made a very interesting point a couple of weeks ago when he said, you know, when people hear things that they agree with, even if they are not right, they're okay with it as long as their side is winning. And that we have to hold something to the truth. We have to hold something to the rules of fair play, the rule of law. Lanny and I are both lawyers. I don't think Kay and you are, but you know, for a few bucks we can get you to pass the bar. Before then, okay, good enough. Good. So, but. You know, our training in law school, the first year of law school, is what's good for the goose, good for the gander, which is if the rules apply one way, they also have to apply the other. We're no longer in that scenario. We're in a situation whoever has power wins. That is not how the Constitution was set up. It was written for the minority. It is designed to protect minority rights. So you know, there's certainly a different play there. Two, everything is political now. If you drink a Starbucks, if you go and shop at Nordstrom's, if you go to Patagonia, you're making a political statement. I don't know about you, but some of us would just like to go shopping, you know, but we can't anymore because everything is a political statement. Three, we all have a lot of really hard questions to ask, and that is, what is our responsibility as citizens? One of the things that when Kayan was talking about the Axios comments, the 4 rules, one of them were for us. What are our rules as citizens? And that is that we have to abide, we have to be responsible, and I think that's we're going exactly the opposite way. And that is a great challenge. Let me leave with 4 rules for companies, and Kayan has already shared with Patagonia how some of those rules, including by the pioneers who helped make them, are already starting to break them. It used to be we'd just be on the sidelines, we wouldn't get involved politically as a company. There are no sidelines. No matter what you do or don't do, you're being political. First, be transparent. Chick-fil-A was transparent about its anti-LGBT stance for years. Granted, they softened it when the son took over, Dan Jr. took over for Dan Cathay, his father, and when they went to both coasts. But they were transparent, and people who disagreed with their position continue to shop at and eat at Chick-fil-A. The reason? People will forgive a different point of view. There was transparency. 2, consistency. The point that Kay-Ann made earlier about Patagonia, they originally got political by fighting the restrictions and closures of national parks in Utah. That was seen as consistent with their mission. Endorsing political candidates clearly moves beyond that. We'll have to see how that goes, but it's certainly a high risk. Then, is there a material purpose for it? If you are a company that does something for material reasons, such as Airbnb supporting Brexit, supporting the fight against Brexit, clearly it was a material interest. And finally, leadership, which I think is the greatest challenge for CEOs. If you compare Lyft with Uber, after the business councils were under fire in the first year of this administration, Uber, the company that said, we're all about breaking the rules, opening up in different cities, going into France without abiding by any of the regulations, said in a very Washington way, we're going to study this. Well, that was seen as followship. But if you compare that with, say, Lyft, on the very night of the Muslim ban, the 8th day of this administration, they announced a $1 million donation to the ACLU. People saw that as leadership. And so more than anything, more than any time in our history, courage and leadership are required. And the most important rule for boards of directors when they hire CEOs is not just can you help monetize this company, but can you help lead us when clearly there's going to be crisis?
So I want to ask a follow-up to Rich's question. Companies have always taken positions. Those of us who are in the practice of public relations have obviously guided and consulted with our clients and our corporate CEOs on what route to take during certain crises or situations that may come up in their history. But we have a difference today. The difference is that we have a president of the United States who actually goes out of his way to intimidate businesses and corporations. Never happened before. Never in the history of the United States has any president ever singled out corporations, for such threatening circumstances as our president does. So companies are living in an age of insults and threats. And my question to you is to be a little bit more specific. The President of the United States insults you and threatens you like he did Harley Davidson, or companies that threaten to take some of their plants and factories out of the U.S. And situations like that. And he will Twitter such companies directly and name them. So here you are, you're the board of directors or the CEO, and you have just been threatened by the President of the United States and singled out. So what do? Do you turn the other cheek? Do you change your policies? Do you retreat? Do you go back into your shell? What advice would you give to your clients if the President of the United States singled you out and threatened you?
Well, I would not return the fire or get into any debate. I would simply focus on the two irrebuttable values that every business should have, which is truth and facts and transparency. So those are all about the same words. And then I would say that corporate responsibility should be speaking out against bigotry and political differences, opinions on policies, all sorts of divisive issues on the political landscape I would avoid as a business. It's not their job to get into politics. Their job is business. But there are certain bright lines about truth and certain bright lines about bigotry that no corporation can afford. It's not good business to not react to something relating to the truth and relating to bigotry. Those are the only two places that I would engage. Otherwise, I would ignore Mr. Trump.
And so the scenario that you present, Art, is one that we've helped clients navigate since the president's been in office. We've had clients, and without giving details, move manufacturing jobs overseas. We've had clients who've been called out by the president on Twitter, and we've helped them navigate it in a way that, exactly what you just said, being transparent, consistent, and truthful. So in the case of one of our clients who was reorganizing and redeploying their workforce, these plans had been in the works for 4 to 5 years and were based on global utilization studies, impact of the business, and we encourage them to stay the course, be transparent, not be responsive or amp up the temperature, but continue to reach their audiences with their message and the workforce and continue the plans. Now, if there was an opportunity to change the plans and that would be more profitable and beneficial to the business and the workforce, absolutely do that. But there weren't those opportunities because these decisions are not made lightly. And so what's an important factor is when you do respond, how do you respond? And how are you reaching the stakeholders and getting your message to them? And what we've seen for clients is that the mediums by which they need to communicate are completely different. First and foremost, internal employee communications, number one. You can't start speaking externally if you haven't taken care of your internal housekeeping and communicated the messages there. We've helped a client that was called out by the president as a poster child for a type of reform he wanted to have, and they had their best financial season in 10 years after that, because the attention actually helped people understand their business, their model, and that in fact this is tit for tat, and they weren't getting into it.
I don't know if our viewing audience could hear it, but I'll show my paranoia from 50 plus years in Washington, where when Lanny was speaking, you could hear the president's 3 helicopters in the background as they were zooming in here, I think, to try and drown out Lanny. But I think what Kayan just said was absolutely spot on. So let's respond holistically to the president's threats. One, let's look at it in terms of the period with which it was a threat. There were 3 weeks in which his tweets were threatening to companies. That is the last 2 weeks of the transition and the first 8 days of the presidency. Ironically, the power of his tweets ended with his call for the travel ban, the Muslim ban, something I just referred to in terms of what Lyft did and how other companies and people and lawyers responded. But his power to tweet, to act as what the stock market refers to as an axe, someone who had the ability to slash stock prices dramatically, was eliminated within 3 days. But the paranoia, the fear from his power lasted longer than that. So that's why you want to have a real understanding of geopolitics, of U.S. politics, and how this new terrain all operates. When you look at the companies he tweeted against, there were 13 initially. 12 of them all had their stocks rebound significantly, very quickly afterwards, despite the radical initial drop. The only one who didn't was Toyota, and Toyota was dealing with other long-term challenges. And if KN is representing Toyota, I'm sure they'll recover fine. But that was the only company, and that was not a result of the Trump tweets. Finally, you mentioned Harley in your question, and I think it's a great question, because even if you abide by the rules of the Trump White House, attacking Harley, which is comprised largely of his base, makes no sense. I don't understand why you would ever want to attack a group that is made up of tattooed veterans, because it is his base. And I think one of the things that does say, no matter what you do, relationships are more fickle than junior high with this president.
I'd like to ask a question.
I'm an expert on that last issue, by the way.
Well, okay.
You're saving it like that.
I'd like to ask the three of you a question that is a little more tactical. When planning a media relations campaign for your clients, do you vary your messaging strategies based on the ideological bias of the media outlets to whom you want to get your messages out?
No.
Well, first of all, for the record, that's the first time in 35 years I've ever heard Lanny with a one-word answer. So I want to, to that I would answer yes and no. I do not believe largely the bias that we all believe that media is biased. Obviously, some are, but the Fourth Estate, by and large, abides by the historic role that we have known for the last 70 or 80 years, certainly as the First Amendment evolved since the early part of the last century, which is there to take a middle-of-the-road position. Editorial boards are different, but the newspaper itself is largely designed to report the news. Of course, there are always exceptions to that. Mark Hartsgaard, some 30 years ago, did a fascinating study about a 200-year history of editorial boards, which actually showed them majority to be more conservative. So I've never purchased or never believed in the liberal media, but for that, but we are now returning to a period, very much the English model, which exists now in the UK and existed here in the early days of the Republic, which is we're having more and more media aligned increasingly, but not entirely, with different political positions. Like Lanny and Kayanne, usually a good story is a good story. But if we want to reach the president, there's no better way to do it than Fox and Friends.
Well, but given how brief Lanny's answer was, I'm going to steal just a little more time here before my colleague asks his next question. We all know that Google and Facebook are responsible for 70% of the way America gets their news. 70%. And they're a duopoly. That being the case, do you design your media strategies for clients specifically for those two digital outlets, and how important are they to you? They certainly are important to the boss.
And I'll build, because it ties into the question you just asked. So for any of our clients, we build a narrative for them. And so what are they trying to say? What do they stand for? And then there's different pillars in there too. So yes and no, to your point, where you may take certain pillars and talking points to different audiences and outlets, but you're not changing your narrative. You're not mercurial to serve a need, or there's nothing unsavory there. It's just matching the messages for the right audience as it lives in your narrative. So how do we then shape that content for the different platforms? I will say our discipline has changed, that we pitch podcasts. We pitch and package content that is deployed solely on digital. We put paid amplification behind that has geo-targeting to make sure it reaches the audience that we're trying to reach. So the days of being able to read a newspaper, tune into something, and you consume your news, that's not how the population's consuming their news. We have to find them and deliver the news to them. Content has to be pithy and short too. The attention span that we see, even for video, which is a preferred content for many population groups, isn't more than 2 to 8 seconds. So how are we getting our content? Yes, we're taking those beautiful narratives we create, and we're deploying them in sound bites to different mediums to make sure that those narratives don't just live in a share drive, that they actually reach the audiences we're trying to reach.
So, point of personal privilege, Richard's absolutely right. I've never answered a question with just one word, so now I'll go back to form and say more than one word. My overall strategy for many, many years in life as well as in this business is that human nature, whether you're a reporter or a real human being who doesn't do journalism and just criticizes reporters, don't want to be embarrassed. And reporters, whether they're left, right, or middle, if they care about their reputations, and that's a big if, and the reason why my no is a little bit too brusque, don't want to be embarrassed about being wrong on the facts.
Right.
It hurts their careers. It embarrasses them among their peers. I find the best weapon against misinformation against my client is to confront in a cordial way a reporter and then an editor. You got it wrong. Let me prove to you you got it wrong. And if I can, would you clarify? I don't use the word correct. That's a bad word. It takes away their dignity. clarify. And so by using that technique and advising my clients, don't give up if you're being maligned or falsified in the social media or anywhere. If there's a responsible person to talk to who cares about the truth, which is a big if, then I focus on getting it right and making the clarification to get it right. I also agree with Richard that there are venues, and social media is one of them, that don't care about the truth, don't care about facts, what you would describe as fake news. And I tell my clients there's not much you're going to be able to do about that. We have an audience that does care about the truth, who are journalists on the left, right, and center. Let's get them to see they got it wrong to make a correction.
Rich, your question's a great one. And, we all have responsibility for this. First, our epistemology has changed, which is how we learn. Remember those caustic Thanksgiving dinners where we all shared differences of opinion? That's because we were exchanging and experimenting with the new ideas we had. It was the Socratic method. But we no longer do that. We bury ourselves in information that we already agree with and then quickly jump down the rabbit hole to reconfirm it, whatever it is, however false it is. Two, I think, and you can tell I'm a lawyer who likes to cook because it's like a cookbook here. I do everything rat-tat-tat. But two, I think in terms of the FANG, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, it wasn't long ago where Google could simply have the tagline, "Do no evil." And that was enough to make us think they were all on Mount Zion. They were our heroes. They were our friends. But clearly, Google and Facebook have extraordinary power. And they have extraordinary power to move information, including false information. The good news is that Pew Trust, Charitable Trust, did a study. Only 5% of people actually believe what they read on the internet. The bad news is they were lying. The other bad news is maybe 5% of people only believe what they're reading, but if it's sent to them by a trusted source, a name that's familiar, that's the key. You're right, Rich. And then people believe it. And that goes to the epistemology issue. We're all in these very, very narrow tribes. And then to follow up on what KN said, in terms of our strategy, I think that there are any number of things from a digital perspective that you can do, but two that are immensely important. One is video. It is more than 50 times more powerful than the written word in terms of reaching the top of the search engines. And if you want to keep a secret, the best way to do it is have it on the second page of Google. So being optimized and found first is critical. And two is your influencer community, because we believe what we see by people whom we think that we trust.
This leads to my next question. And by the way, I think after my next question, I think we're going to open it up to our guests here and to have some of the written questions that are coming in over the internet. We have three institutions. We have for the practice of public relations, we have the practice of media, and of course the two of them have had an uneasy working relationship for many, many years. The media sometimes doesn't want to deal with public relations. I can't say that across the board, but there's been an uneasy relationship, and yet the media relies very heavily, as we all know, on public relations practitioners for news, for trends, for forecasts, and certainly corporate news, and news of all types, politics as well. And then, of course, we have the institution of the presidency. All three relying on present technology. The media is changing, because of the slow demise of print publications and print media, and the fast growth of online publications, Google and what have you. Public relations is changing because it too has come into the age of technology with interactive and digital and so on. And of course, the President of the United States, who relies on technology because of his twittering. Can you imagine Abraham Lincoln twittering? I can't. So, given all this and this really this dramatic change in the way the world communicates, I'll start with this question: how do you think public relations people who are coming into the business, what do they need to be told now, and how should they be trained? And as a follow-up to that, how do you think that the media should respond to the association it's had for ages and ages with the practice of public relations?
I'm happy to start. As a global agency, we're always recruiting and looking for talent. I will say what always impresses me and what I see is that news is not being consumed the way we used to. You have the whole cutting the cord. You have an entire generation that gets their news off YouTube and social media platforms. As such, to be successful in the public relations industry, you have to be able to be fluent in that discipline. You have to understand how to create that type of content. You also have to understand how to break through and amplify it. So, Richard shared an important puzzle piece that I don't think we talked enough about today, the influencer community, and how do you amplify, and not just through paid amplification, but how do you get that third party validator to carry your message and give it weight? And so a lot of what I think is important is not just the traditional pitching, news outlets, earned media. It's being able to identify stakeholders, identify them, educate them, activate them on behalf of your clients, and then deploy that information in the channels that people are consuming. So how are you getting, there's a whole Pod Save America generation. That's where they're getting their news. And so do you listen to podcasts? Do you know how to optimize content on podcasts, and that you need to write a review and get it to raise up? And so if you are a PR professional, you need to at least build teams that are fluent in that and can reverse mentor you or be fluent enough. Otherwise, your message is going to get lost in the clutter.
Well, I'm struck by the 2 to 6 seconds attention span comment you made, because I think I'm the only one in the room that has 2 generations of children. Now, if anybody else here it's like me, raise your hand. I have 2 older children with 6 grandchildren, so I'm a 60s baby boomer generation. I now have a 20-year-old and a 13-year-old. And the 20-year-old and the 13-year-old are in the 2 to 6 second attention span social media world, which I've had to not only learn how to use my thumbs on an iPhone as opposed to a BlackBerry, but to understand how they pick up their news. And what I've learned is that the fundamentals are still true. Simple message with simple facts that they understand. So when I'm doing a campaign, I have to come up with a headline that my 20-year-old says, yeah, Dad, that makes sense. I represent one very difficult client who has caused me to be on television a little bit too much. And I used to get a phone call from my older son saying, Dad, you got to do better. Now my 2 younger boys say, Dad, you got to make it simpler. And I think simplicity, facts, and keeping it short are the fundamentals now in today's social media world.
Well, Art, forgive me because we go back a long way, but I need to correct you, and that is Lincoln did tweet. His Gettysburg address was 264 words, so it was almost short enough to be a tweet. And to Lanny's point, though, he did understand his audience. Now, I think, where most people, certainly boards and CEOs, get this wrong is they think that it's a digital revolution. It's not. It's an information revolution. And the difference is not the device you use, but it's the power to share. That's where empowerment comes from. Do you remember when we were all in college and our parents would see an interesting article, or we would, and we'd cut it out, we'd put it in an envelope? Took a while for that to go right? Took that a while to go viral, right? It's much different now. Information comes from the grassroots on up. That means for the first time in history, we are truly a democracy, not a republic. We have been living the lie that this is a democracy. It's not. It was designed as a republic. And a republic means representative. So if we knew the key reporters, we knew the key financial analysts, you knew where to advertise, you knew where to lobby and provide PAC funding, you were done. Very top down. It was like the old outer limits. We control the horizontal, we control the vertical. No longer. It's now emanating from the grassroots up. If you look at most of the major issues of the day, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, sugar, fracking, Keystone, The list goes on and on. Starbucks in Philadelphia. Those issues emanate from the grassroots up. And then we have to respond. And the difference is for corporate communicators, you always had the time to react. There is no time to react. You have to be proactive. And probably the greatest example of that is with United. And you saw a little over a year ago, Dr. Dow gets kicked off of the plane in United. And here's the punchline. All right, United took 17 hours between the Sunday Sunday evening, tweets about it and video until Oscar Munoz, the CEO, saw it in the Chicago Tribune. For those of you online who don't know, Chicago Tribune is a newspaper. It's these things we used to get on our front doors, and you get ink on your hands, and you could do crossword puzzles in them. But he waited, and that's why he made the series of mistakes, because they were not tracking on Sunday night. And the story gets far more and more complicated in terms of how they went down the drain over the next 72 hours and lost the Chinese market, where 20 million Chinese an hour by Wednesday were downloading the video. But the key issue is, the punchline is that Oscar Munoz, when he was at CSX, was a brilliant CEO in crisis. And if Oscar Munoz at United could make this kind of mistake, what are all of us doing when it comes to a digital world where things come out of the blue and we don't see them either for the speed or where they emanate from?
And a quick point there on Oscar Munoz is, it was almost a divide in our profession. In March, just a few months before, he was named Communicator of the Year. And then we saw how that was almost a tipping point to now, how do we communicate in speed, in precision, in keeping it simple? And I would argue that was yet another breaking point in our profession.
Lanny Davis, unfortunately, has to leave us. Our discussion will continue through its appointed rounds. Is there any last comment you'd like to make, Lanny, before you take off?
Well, first, my very good reason is that I am in my second generation of children, and my 13-year-old today has parent-teachers conferences. I was mandated not to miss them, and I was off in my scheduling. I do want to thank this fantastic panel and audience and all of you for inviting me, and just go back to my central and pretty old-fashioned concept of facts and simplicity, and fight back on the internet distortions, because it's Googled and gets you 1 million hits, doesn't make one word true. In grade school, we were taught you can multiply the largest number you can think of times 0, and you get 0. Please don't believe that there's truth that's reflected by the number of Google hits that a distorted piece of information creates. And fight back is my last message.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Well, Lanny, just want you to know, because of technology, we've actually arranged to have both your son and the teacher on the webinar, so you can
Thank you, Lanny.
Lanny, great to see you.
Do we have any questions from our live audience here today? Anybody would like to ask a question? Doug? No?
I have one. Oh, but no, you please.
So I'd like, you spoke of Harley as your case example, but can you talk a little about Amazon and the attacks of the president on it, the facts that I think were incorrectly presented, and they are now embarked on a decision about where to place their next headquarters, which could be outcome determinative of a lot of things, political and otherwise. So can you give us some thinking about, were you retained by them, how you might respond to what the president's accusations were?
So the question, I don't know if the audience could hear because I know you're not mic'd up, is some examples of communications with other companies, in this case Amazon, and they've been attacked by the president. How does it impact the headquarters? Let me first say no, that we were not retained by them. In fact, it's the other way around. I'm the single reason why Amazon is now in the black. I have bought so many products from Amazon over the years. I think Jeff Bezos has played it very smart. The president has singled out Amazon both for the false facts on the their postage deal, but also because he is the owner now of one of their largest and most powerful critics, the Washington Post, whom, along with the New York Times and CNN, he considers to be among his greatest critics. But I think that Bezos has played it very well, that he has largely ignored him, that he has largely wrapped himself in the First Amendment, separated the Washington Post from Amazon. He is going to make the headquarters decision. Washington, D.C. is certainly a possibility, along with at least still a half dozen other cities, although he does, I believe, have a home here now. I think that on the opposite end of Amazon, you have Elizabeth Warren, who took the president's bait and decided for no reason known to humankind to respond, and it's worked very, very poorly for her. And I think Amazon largely ignoring has been a net positive. Kayan?
And so, in full disclosure, we represent Amazon Web Services, so I'm going to abstain from that question.
So I should just pay you directly now, is what you're saying when I order things.
You spoke a lot about obviously social media and being able to listen to that very closely and advise your clients. What do you do about the foreign interference, such as Russia, for instance? There's much evidence of them trying to sort of divide both sides, like the GMO fight, anti-vaccines, energy pipelines. What do you do about that?
Great, thanks, Kay. And we can see how close we are. Richard, that feels like a really hot potato. Do you mind? I'd love to, Kay. And let me see if I can step in it before you do. I think that you have to take that as part of the equation. And for the audience, the question is, how do you counsel your clients on the potentiality of foreign interference? I think that's a two-way question. Obviously, for North Korea and Iran, whom you cannot represent, for the Russians, who you still can, you have to make decisions. We, as many other firms in this city, have been asked to represent the Kremlin before the last election cycle. That was a difficult enough question then. It's certainly difficult now. It is remarkable how many people suddenly die, and I'm being very serious here now in terms of dealing with Putin, including some people close to me who've been involved in Russian matters. Having said that, I think for all nation states, their challenge on the way in is how do we communicate now inside the Beltway, in which we used to know how the rules were played, and now they are elastic. We don't understand. I think for our clients, issues of patriotism, nationalism, interference are all part of the topography. I would argue this. I think all of our jobs have changed radically, as I said at the outset, but never more so than the import of bringing in intelligence early on. We first started building it here and then just outsource it to trusted partners who are almost all former CIA, DOD, DIA, et cetera, because you have to know that the strategy is informed by intelligence. What's really happening here? Is this really a shareholder fight, or is there something more sinister behind it? Is this really an NGO? Where are they getting their funding from? It tells us in nation-state issues not only what's happening, but it informs what we can do.
And to build on what Richard said, we always look at influence and the stakeholders we're trying to reach and whether or not a response is warranted and what that response needs to be. So if it's in cases of bots or if it's in cases of a front group that's not really, an influential NGO or others, that we take all of that into account as we advise and counsel clients how to respond, if to respond. So I would say matching up influence, impact, risk. It's a complicated algorithm, if you will, but all of that helps us calibrate the response and the method in which we respond as well.
And I think, and Kayan used a word that's so critical, risk. And the risks are entirely different than they used to be. One rule of thumb for companies foreign companies who are doing business in the U.S. And for U.S. companies doing business in foreign jurisdictions, the jurisdiction where the challenge, opportunity, or crisis arises is the jurisdiction where those communications rules dictate. If you're a Japanese company with a problem in Nigeria, the Nigerian rules dictate. If you're a Chinese company that's here, then the U.S. media rules dictate, et cetera, et cetera. And that's never been more important than now. And to Kayan's point, not only do we have to understand risk, but communicators have to be more fulsome, have to understand legal issues, business issues, conspiracy issues, nation-state issues. It's just a much different world. The services we offer that just 15 years ago to be in PR was smile and dial are just a wee bit more complicated today.
Well, I have a final question that sort of, I think, will put an exclamation point on our session this afternoon. And my question is, what do you think will be the most important issues facing public relations professionals as a result of the probable continuation of the Trump presidency for at least the next 2 years, possibly 6?
I think continuing to find the compass for your clients, your organizations, what you're trying to achieve, and work towards that mission with transparency and consistency, and getting those messages out there. I think we also can't underestimate the necessity of being able to be flexible and realize how we need to adapt to this breakneck news cycle, which is 24 hours a day. And so right now, let's say certain topics and wedge issues are on the forefront. In less than 2 weeks after midterm elections, that's likely going to pivot and shape again. And how do we look at our playbooks, our responses, our counsel, and realize that something that you could bake for, let's say, 2019 planning and we're good to go, that kind of cycle doesn't exist anymore. You have to always self-evaluate. You have to always calibrate for risk. You have to always make sure you have that goal in mind and advocate for that goal on behalf of your clients using communications and influence.
Rich, I'm not sure you're going to like my answer because it's less a communications answer and more a responsible citizen answer. But how do we exist in an environment where already as of this afternoon, just before we went on air, now 10 people, either Democrats or media, have had pipe bombs placed in mailed to their homes or actually making it to their homes or offices. It means we are losing a level of trust and unified spirit that we all grew up on that meant that we were safe, certainly from homegrown terrorists since the revolution or since the Civil War. We are, I think, entering a time where all of us are going to be afraid to open our mail or walk into our offices. How will that impact communications in every possible way? There's a greater level of anger in this country than certainly 1968 to 72, the height of the anti-Vietnam War and civil rights struggles, but it's approaching 1856 to 1864, the Civil War. But I also wonder what are all of our responsibilities going to be as communicators, as lawyers, as media, when we get, and if we seem to be moving and spiraling the direction of 1930s Germany, which moves towards, through an elected government, more totalitarian state. And at what point is our responsibilities, as Thomas Jefferson said, to defend democracy as Americans, as individuals, rather than depending on our government. So all of those things are all within, tragically, the realm of possibility, and it does mean that each of us have a responsibility to vote, to tell the truth, to help our clients navigate these very challenging times, and to do the very best we can and be able to look in the mirror every night and say that we have done our best for our country, for our community, and for our God.
Well, on that note, Art.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank those of you who have tuned in today, who have been here in person. I'd like to thank our host. I'd like to thank Richard Levick for the use of his facilities. I'd like to thank our entire panel, Richard Levick, Kayanne Schulman, and the absent Lanny Davis, who was quite vocal while he was here, my partner, Rich Giacchetti, Faye Shapiro. We are living in tumultuous times, everybody. Whether the next 2 years will be as tumultuous as these current 2 years have been, time will tell. Will we be a more civil nation? Will we have a more volatile nation? I think some of the responses by our panelists can help lead your thinking in terms of where we're going to be 2 years from now and maybe for the rest of our history of the United States. Thank you very much. Tune in again next time. Signing off. Thank you very much. This is Art Stevens.